Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for the Greater Des Moines Partnerships DSM Forward webinar, Legal Considerations for Getting Back to the Workplace. I think I know most of you who are on this webinar, but for those of you who don't know me, I am Jay Byers, CEO of the Greater Des Moines Partnership. Just a few reminders as we start this. For logistics, make sure to mute your microphone and to turn off your video to save bandwidth if you could, and then to open the chat window and use that for questions as we move forward. We expect this to be a very robust discussion and dialogue. Again, I look forward to all of your questions, and we will have a recording of this that will be available. So joining us today, we have three excellent attorneys. We have Frank Hardy with Nyemaster Good. We have Michelle Brott with Davis Brown, and Kelsey Knowles with Bell & McCormick. And we all know with COVID-19 that employers are facing a host of new legal issues and challenges as they're bringing employees back to work. This can include the need to put together a master plan for returning to work, and all kinds of issues regarding employers' duty to maintain a safe workplace, OSHA, FMLA, ADA, and so many other potential legal issues. What some of you may not know about me is I actually am an attorney by trade, and my first job out of law school was actually working as an employment and labor attorney at a big firm in Indianapolis, Indiana. So I have a pretty good feeling for what these three do, but really don't have a great feeling on this sort of new environment with all these new challenges. I can only imagine all the different new HR-related issues and employee safety issues that they're all weighing and advising their clients. So a big thank you to these three for joining us. I know they're super busy, but they're providing tremendous guidance for their clients and for our region, moving as we've gone through this pandemic and as we're bringing people back to work. So really looking forward to a robust discussion today. And what we're going to do is just have some opening remarks, and we're gonna have Frank, Michelle, and Kelsey have some opening remarks, and then really the goal here is to have lots of robust Q&A as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank to get us started, and let's see where this discussion goes.
Thanks, Jay. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody, and I guess I'll keep my opening remarks very brief. I've got four kids, and my oldest daughter's married to a naval aviator, and I thought a good comparison for doing this right for the clients, and I know that the entire panel is basically serving not just as lawyers, but they're also they're taking care of their own offices too, as am I. So I liken this to landing an aircraft on an aircraft carrier in maybe heavy seas. And that is, it's got to be, the Goldilocks. It's got to be just right, and that's the way I look at it, at least. I don't know if anybody. Yeah, that was all I had for.
Okay, Michelle.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Brott. I'm an attorney at the Davis Brown Law Firm. Like Frank mentioned, we're all advising our own offices on how to reopen and how to get folks back to where we're going. For the last couple months, this has been all that is on everyone's mind. I'm very grateful that we're at the point of this pandemic where we're talking about how we're getting people back to work. When it started, it was all how we're sending folks home. And so we're at the point now where there's a bit of a transition and sea change that we're coming back. It's important to come back. It's important to address the fear that your employees may have and to get these conversations going so that we can have a successful return and jump back with the Iowa economy. So happy to be here and happy to help.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Kelsey Knowles at Bell & McCormick, and I'm very happy to be here this afternoon and participate in this conversation. I think if there's one lesson that we've all learned over these last 2 months is that sometimes we really don't know what's going to happen next week or 2 weeks from now or a month from now. And so one of the big lessons I think that's important as we go into this return our people to work is to be open to trying different things that are maybe contrary to the way we thought things always had to be be done, and not to be afraid to try something and then to say, hey, that really didn't work. That was really awkward. That was really uncomfortable. So we're not going to do it anymore. And to not get so bogged down in trying to forecast the future and will this work 2 months from now or 6 months from now, that we're not even willing to try it. And so I think being willing to adapt is really one of the lessons that we all have to absorb from the past 2 months as we go into this new phase.
Well, thanks again for joining us. And Frank, I know you got a slide deck there. I might just have you just really briefly maybe just go through it on a very high level, just to sort of lay some framework, and then maybe have Michelle and Kelsey provide some color on it. And then I think as we go through that, I think we'll generate some really interesting questions and discussion. Is that okay, Frank?
That's fine with me. Perfect. Thanks, Jay. And we can either, I'll kind of walk through can we have the next slide, please? The first slide there has the quotes that are sort of self-explanatory. Helen Keller's quote about exposure was I found pretty inspirational, but Mark Twain saying that if you do it right, you'll gratify some, but you'll astonish the rest. And I think that's the one that I don't know about the other panel members, but I'm shooting for astonishing when it comes to our own shop. But the pre-return checklist is just something that come up with comprehensively. It's literally combining. I think when we decided that this was the scope that this was going to reach, at my firm, we created what we call a tiger team. We've got a couple of military folks. And so there's 15 lawyers that have been focusing on this from all different aspects of our practice. And I just checked today, we got 61 articles that we've posted on our website. So if there's any, and most of them have links to all the things we might talk about, as do both Bellin and Davis too, I know. So anything you're curious about here, you should be able to just get on a website and find your way there. So what we've looked at is that for the next stage is, of course, turn to the governor, or if you're in a multi-state operation, whatever government you have to worry about. But we think that the important thing, because we do believe that there's going to be a wave of litigation, maybe successful, maybe unsuccessful. So the key is to have everything documented. Have everything done and documented before you start to open the gates. And that's what this checklist is literally intended to do that. And then, I've got the guidance from the CDC, from OSHA. That's where most of this is taken from, distilling those things. But the things that we've looked at is making sure from a legal standpoint that everything's ready to go. Preparing your physical space. I know the other panelists will be able to talk about how they've advised clients on making changes. One of the things that we've advised everyone to make sure that if you bring folks back, you've got enough supplies and material to keep them back, despite what the experts may or may not predict is going to happen in the fall. Refine and figure out your recall procedures. Be prepared. I know probably the other panelists have done this too, but we've been working on checklists and what happens, what's the best document to use once someone comes back and tests positive or has a loved one test positive, because we all know that's going to happen statistically. And that's what this, and then determine who may be left behind. I think Kelsey was sort of alluding to this. We, and Jay, in his past life, we were always advising folks, you don't want to make a promise. Or if you're going to let someone work from home, one of the first things we did was we said, please let everyone know this is a temporary arrangement, because you don't want to have someone come back later on and say, hey, I think I need an accommodation under the ADA working at home. I'm going to be able to say, oh, wait a minute. But I just saw it's going to be released here pretty soon, I think, but I just saw a survey of large Des Moines employers looks like half of them nearly aren't going to bring folks back until after August 1. And it looks like there's a lot of them that say at least a third of their people may never come back. So when Kelsey and Michelle talk about thinking outside the box, looks like a lot of folks are doing that. That's all I wanted to talk about for the overall checklist. And I don't know if Kelsey, Michelle, do you guys want to talk about this now, or should we run through them? How do you want to do it, Jay?
I think this would be great in terms of the checklist, and Kelsey and Michelle in terms of other things that people need to be thinking about, and maybe what are sort of two or three of the biggest themes that you're hearing from your clients in terms of where they need the most help at this point, and what are those sort of big issues that you're hearing the most about?
Some of the big issues that we've seen are that folks are trying to tackle some, not only the plan on how we're going to move folks in, but then recognizing that as part of that communication, how they're going to pivot when they need to, because there's going to be a need. We're getting new information all the time, right? Suddenly everyone's talking about ventilation a lot as it relates to COVID. 2 weeks ago, we were all talking about face coverings, and now we're talking about ventilation. As we prepared to talk to you all today, Frank was saying some of this stuff is coming in generations, and that's what it is. There's a lot of subject matters that are coming all at the same time, and we're all taking it in and learning from it. So that's one thing that we, as employers, your employees are looking to you as the captain of the ship, knowing when we need to pivot. One of the things I've discussed with my clients is we are all Iowans, and we know how to prepare for a blizzard. Every day at work, like there's going to be a blizzard, because we may have to send folks home. Somebody may wake up with symptoms and not want. So part of that is the pivot in understanding that we may have to send people home. We may receive word that an employee tests positive. We may receive word that there is another outbreak either in our building that we occupy or something with our individual employees. So preparing for that blizzard so folks can continue to pick up the pieces is part of that agility and creativity that'll keep us going.
I agree with everything that Frank and Michelle have said. I think having checklists and documentation in place is really important. I would add two things to that. One is I would be cautious about using other businesses and model documents that don't fit well to your business. So what works really well for a large manufacturing company doesn't work well for a 50-person law firm or, a 5-person accounting firm or a retail business. And so I do think it's really important that you think through those practical considerations of, does this make sense? Is it practical for my business? And what might work well in my business? Even if you're talking about the same industry, size and scope really matter a lot. So I think it's really important when you go through those checklists to just put your practical hat on and think about whether it makes sense. And along that same line, as you're using that sort of practical thinking, I think it's really important to think through sort of physically how things work. So by way of example, we've got a lot of employers that are doing things like temperature screenings when people show up to work in the morning. And when I've talked to clients, I've talked about, so what does that look like? And if I walk up and you screen my forehead and I have a temperature, where do I physically go? Do I just turn and walk away and you have no idea that I reported to work that day? Do I talk to someone else and now have contact with that other person? And so I think really thinking through your physical process of how those things are going to work in your workspace, right? Where is that person? Where do they go? Who do they talk to? And kind of just vetting that out and maybe even physically walking through it, going and walking through your building. Do you have certain areas that are really tight spaces that no one could possibly social distance? And so maybe you've got to put up a sign that says, we have a small coffee oasis in our law firm and it's not big enough for 2 people to be 6 feet apart. It's just not, right? So we might need to say, hey, only one person is in here making their coffee at a time, because that's the only way to be far enough apart. But physically walking through and making those decisions and thinking, what am I trying to achieve? And how do I practically achieve that? I think, we all really have to put those practical hats on and think through that process.
So I'm going to ask a question here. So, there's this question in terms of, these, industry standards and so forth. And you've hopefully all have seen sort of the playbooks that the Great Des Moines Partnership has sort of put together, sort of industry by industry. We were very careful and to make sure to put a legal disclaimer that this isn't legal advice, but really looked at whether it was CDC recommendations or, state associations, national associations, some combination thereof, but really meant just to be sort of these guidelines as companies and organizations are looking to come back. And Kelsey, you sort of mentioned this, what might work for manufacturing might not work for retail, but even what might work for big retail might not work for small retail, all those sort of things. How are you sort of managing this sort of duty of care in terms of what will be these expectations if there is some level of breakout? And, in terms of, preparing for future lawsuits, how are you sort of managing, advising that level of duty of care?
I mean, I personally feel like this is one of those times where it's really important to collaborate with your peers. And, a lot of people, a lot of business owners know other business owners, and to talk about what people are doing to find that best standard of care. And, this isn't the point where you want to go rogue and do something different than everyone else is doing, unless that thing you're doing is, extra protection. But knowledge is power in that way. And so, you're not sharing state secrets, you're not sharing financial projections, you're talking about how to keep people safe. And so I think that kind of communication can be really helpful. I know the law firms have done it, right? People are talking about, when are you reopening? Are you doing this? Those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo what Kelsey said. There's no reason to go rogue. You don't want to be an outlier. We've turned to a lot of associations, a lot of groups within different industries to ask about questions. I remember when we were first closing things down and people talking about turning their business to drive-through only, particularly financial institutions. And there was some comfort in knowing, well, are other banks doing this? Or, whatever the industry is, because you want your consumer, your customer, your client, your patient, whoever you're dealing with at the end that's keeping your business running, if they have some level of consistency, then they know how to react too. We're all navigating that new normal. But staying ahead of the curve as much as possible, speaking with your trusted sources of information, watching the CDC. Unfortunately, this also means a little bit of taking in all of the news, right? And so that's a lot to take in while trying to operate your business, keeping your employees safe. But that OSHA general duty clause is out there. And we all acknowledge that COVID-19 spread in the workplace is one of those potential workplace dangers now that we as employers need to work towards mitigating. We're doing that in our office, right? In our law firm, we are presently closed to the public. We are hoping to find a date that we are going to reopen to the public. We have over 100 staff members. For anyone who's ever been in our building before, it's a big box. People talk about maybe you need to have one-way traffic. What's that going to look like for the person who needs to use a restroom who's on the outside of that box, right? They have to lap the entire building to get to a restroom. That might not work very well. So each business place has its own both productivity and operations concerns, and then staff concerns. And this is not a time to cut corners. You also want to hear from your own people what is making them uncomfortable. Make sure that there's an outlet for them to communicate when they do return to the office or before what their concerns are. That doesn't mean you're going to get all good information, but if you want to be able to hear from people so that you can maybe get ahead of something that's affecting either morale or causing a distraction as people are trying to readjust.
Yeah, Jay, I would agree. Those are all good points. And I would also say, don't be afraid to at least try something that seems a little bit odd. I've got a picture that I've been lucky enough to have access to some really, really smart people on the healthcare side. And one of them predicted this way back in January. I wish I listened and I made some changes professionally, but I didn't change my environment. I didn't change my investment portfolio. So there you go. But anyway, I think there's a good chance that college students, or the colleges that are going to be opening in the fall for a physical presence, they're going to be wearing what looks like lightweight welding helmets. And I was shocked when I learned that, but I've come to conclude that it's probably, and if you do the research on it, there is someone at the University of Iowa who has done studies on this. Now, I think if you go into a retail establishment and there are people in there wearing glass shields that look like almost like welding helmets that are light duty, it's going to be a little bit strange. But I really think that the advice, don't go rogue. I think don't go rogue on the ignoring it side. If you want to get out in front on the side that is unless you're doing something that's so exotic that you can be criticized for having harmed someone. I think that if you make those decisions and then document what you're doing, you're probably not going to regret it, because I believe that if there's any crack that we're going to see in the litigation, either in the workers' comp, I think it's going to be gross negligence cases. And I think it's going to be those egregious situations where, with 20/20 hindsight, somebody says, well, they knew for 8 days that someone had been exposed, but they didn't roll out, PPE for everybody until the 9th day, et cetera, something like that. So I think getting exotic on the I'll call it the nerdy side, probably safer than being the rugged individualist.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially, as was mentioned earlier, that the science, I guess, continues to evolve as, in terms of just even CDC recommendations, right? So that sort of standard is somewhat of a moving target, right? So maybe this is more of a policy question, but are you hearing, what we're hearing in terms of there's possible federal and state legislation in terms of limiting liability for some of these issues, or what are you hearing from your associations on that?
I'll just say that I know that that and you guys all have lobbyist partners. They're preparing for that for various business interests. Now, whether it happens and the scope from a state level, not sure. And these are clearly different times, but yeah, Jay, we're hearing that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's certainly been in some of the proposed legislation. Hasn't gained a ton of traction yet, but that is in the background, right? So like Frank said, the scope, what industries are going to benefit from it, we don't know yet, but it'll be interesting to see. I wouldn't conduct your business in a way that expects any sort of legislation, but at the same time, which I don't think was implicated by your question at all, but hopefully we will see some relief for employers who made the best decision with the information they had at the time, and not judging them after the fact, other than the information they had at the time.
Definitely something for us. We're watching that as well, as you can imagine. So
yeah,
interesting times for sure. Let's dive into the recall return procedures. I know that's a huge issue right now in terms of everybody sort of putting their playbooks together. And, Frank, you sort of mentioned, what you're hearing in terms of different industries at different times. I think a lot of us on this call right now have been lucky in that we've had jobs that we can work remotely and could work remotely for a while. And maybe, as Frank said, maybe some people will continue to work remotely. But that being said, that there's lots of industries out there that doesn't really work. Manufacturing and other sort of industries. How are you sort of advising your clients with those jobs where you do have to have a physical presence, some of which never did close, right? But in terms of those employees who maybe have health issues that they're concerned about, don't feel comfortable coming back, in some level, somewhere on that spectrum, right? And how do you sort of manage that in terms of, yeah, you need to work, or you're going to be let go, or you won't qualify for unemployment. And again, there's cases all across the board. How do you sort of manage that as a, for example, a manufacturer?
You want me to go? I can do that. The manufacturers that we do work for, typically, they have such a robust industrial engineering, ergonomic engineering staff that they've got this covered, if you will. And so it's really just a matter of, at least from my standpoint, our role has been filling in maybe gaps every now and then. Well, what if this person does not want to return, and they've contacted workforce development and they've received this answer, which, by the way, those answers have changed over the last, as everyone probably knows. There's been a number of, and I'm not being critical of anybody. It's just, you talk about a dynamic environment, but we've typically basically just filled in gaps where our clients who have really good internal teams have the big pieces figured out. At least that's been my stand, my approach.
Yeah, we've certainly had a variety of types of clients that have, those sorts of issues. But I think one of the things we've done is fill in those sorts of gaps. And then I've also told clients to really talk to their employees and try to get to the root of what their concerns are if they're concerned about coming back, and understanding whether the employee's concern is a health concern or a safety concern, or if it's an employee that generally has a concern about, leaving their home. I mean, I think we've all probably found that folks dealing with this pandemic really kind of fall on a bell curve, with people on one side that, have no concerns at all, and people on one side that are very afraid, and then a lot of people dispersed in the middle. And, I think you're trying to balance your legal concerns, your operational concerns, and your employee relations concerns. And that requires having a conversation and understanding what the employee's issue is, what's driving them to not want to return when you ask them to return, and seeing if there's a creative solution. And, we've got folks who just decide that they don't want to come in. And then, we've got folks who have a family member in their household who's undergoing chemotherapy, and their concern is of a totally different nature. And so I think that conversation is important, because, you do want those folks sometime in the future when you're able to reopen. And there are lots of considerations at play. You've got OSHA considerations, you have NLRB considerations, if you've got employees who are worried about your workforce that you want to be taking into account.
Well, and really important about what Kelsey just said there is getting to that why, because that may be the in for an accommodations conversation, right? So if an employee is telling you that they're really too scared to come in, you may be hearing someone on the edge of that bell curve. Okay, look, hey, you got to shut the news off. You got to take a breath. Where everything's going to be great. We're going to be able to work through this. We're going to social distance. We're going to have face coverings. But then what you might be overlooking is the fact that if somebody's got a mental health condition that has been exacerbated by this pandemic, that might be something that you need to reasonably accommodate. So it might not be someone just dragging their heels and either, maybe from somebody's perspective, taking advantage of the situation, or somebody expressing just some generalized concerns and fears. If somebody says, look, I had anxiety before this and I'm not doing so well, they might not come right out and say it, but you have an obligation under the Americans with Disabilities Act to sort of be on your toes to hear those types of invitations to have that interactive process. And everyone is moving at the speed of light. And I definitely get that. That is my concern. That's been our concern so far, is that's where the claims are going to come from too, is skipping over that interactive process, because you hear one thing, it translates to another, because we're moving really fast and dealing with a lot of information. So don't fall into that trap. If somebody is telling you something, take the extra minutes to dig into that, or suspend the conversation, come back to it when you have the time, because those ADA interactive process questions, those are ripe for issues.
So nice. We covered, ADA, those sort of things. What about sort of like leave policy with what are some of the big issues with FMLA? Just in terms of PTO, those sort of things. What are some of the issues that are coming up in terms of what counts, what doesn't count? How does that interact with unemployment, all those sort of things?
I can just chime in. Oh, Kelsey, were you going to go ahead?
Go right ahead. You're fine.
And again, that's what we were chatting before we went live, that it's almost like their generations or waves of questions that come. And of late, I think we've all been dealing with the way that the unemployment benefits and the ESPLA and the FFCRA work together or not. And that the fact that the target has been changing. You know, I've got questions. I've had questions that the answer has literally been 180 degrees different depending upon which week they call. You know, if these conditions are present, will this employee, who we want back, by the way, will they receive state and federal supplemental unemployment benefits? The answer was at some point, no. And at some point, yes. And again, I'm not being critical of anyone. We at the very beginning, OSHA, if there was no community spread, if you had a workplace where someone said, I think I've been exposed here, you had to do certain things, you had to document it, et cetera. Whereas once community spread became so widespread in various jurisdictions, that was loosened up. So I guess, and it's not frustrating. It's in some respects, it's probably fun. Michelle and Kelsey probably have a more normal idea of fun than I do, but I don't find these things. I know that some of my partners have said, this is great. It's like a puzzle. Well, okay, I don't know. That's my 2 cents on that.
You know, I've run into sort of two interesting PTO leave questions that I think are unique things to sort of think about, especially as we start returning to work. One of them that I know a lot of businesses are starting to look at is the fact that their employees are not taking PTO, especially office environments that have sent their employees home. You know, a lot of people didn't go on spring break. They're canceling their summer vacations. And there are some employers out there worried that they're going to get to year end with a fairly large financial hit on the books, depending on how their PTO policy works. So one sort of not directly related to how people take PTO for sickness, but thing I think to think about with your PTO plan is, again, walking through those practical things. If, for example, you pay out PTO at year end, what does that look like? And this year might be bigger, and can you financially sustain that if you've already been sustaining a pandemic? Or do you want to tell your employees now in, you know, end of May, beginning of June, hey, you all need to take a vacation, even if that vacation is cleaning out your garage? Another sort of interesting PTO question that a couple of our clients have talked about and been thinking about that I think is interesting to ponder as you think about returning to work is creating a different way to deal with leave for contagious illness. So a lot of employers have PTO that we use for sickness, and, you know, our dog goes to the vet and a snow day and vacation and all of those things that sort of discourages folks from staying home when they're sick. And I think culturally, before all of this, there's a little bit of, you know, people push through it and they come to work even though they're sick. And there's going to be a cultural shift there where we don't want people to do that. And some employers are starting to think about, how do we have a way that encourages people to stay home when they're sick, but doesn't take advantage of that? And, you know, is there maybe a different bank that we have that, you know, if a doctor diagnoses you with something contagious, then that's a different type of leave policy. And again, thinking creatively in how you manage those incentives for your employees to stay home when they're sick, but also manage their leave time responsibly. And I think that's something that's evolving out of the challenges of managing time off through the first 2 months of this ordeal.
A question that I've gotten a couple times since folks have been returning to work, and I don't know when this policy started, but for surgeries, for personal surgeries, or even for work comp surgeries, that people are being asked to quarantine like 2 or 3 days before they come in and have a surgery done. And so we've been asked, is that emergency paid sick leave? Okay, well, on the one hand, it's an order from a doctor to quarantine. It's related to COVID. On the other hand, like if it's a personal surgery, if it's, you know, my knee, or if my knee was a work surgery, okay, well, if it's a work surgery, it's got a closer relationship. Is it the personal injury? So it's not. And, who's going to be the ultimate decider of whether that time is under the Families First Corona Relief Act, because it's going to be reimbursed to you? The Department of Treasury. So, those are the kind of unique situations that are coming up, that are requiring us to really analyze what these leave policies, how they interrelate, and how these sort of quarantine orders are coming down, and not just from the government, not just because someone traveled, and not just because of exposure. These preemptive quarantines are just a new part of life now at this point. So what that means for work, as we bring more people back, we're going to learn more about that. That's a consideration that we've seen for people opening their offices back, under the Families First, for folks who have children who are still not in school, who can't find a summer camp or childcare. Are you going to lose a lot of your parents, right? If you're letting them telework now and you're getting some productivity out of them. And I say parents, even though it's a touch broader than that, but for the most part, it's parents. And you're getting your productivity out of them now. If you say they can't telework and you insist they come back to the office, are they going to use their Families First leave? And are they going to go out in that emergency FMLEA and, supplement it maybe with some of that PTO that they haven't used, so that they have full wages and summer with their kids? I'm sure that they can imagine worse ways to spend their time. That's not great for us who are trying to keep our businesses going. So if we push to reopen too soon, we do have to balance how that's going to look when folks have access to these leaves.
Lots and lots of interesting issues and questions. I do want to note, and if you were looking at the comments, that KCCI has reported a tornado actually between Waukee and Dallas Center. So if you're in that part of the area, you might want to take your computer to the basement. But anyway, since we are talking about employee safety, that Mike Jefferson now is our weather person, texting me with updates. So that's the latest.
I heard something outside. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, looks like there's sunshine to my back here, but anyway, welcome to Iowa. So anyway.
Maybe I should prepare for a tornado instead of blizzard. That would have been more.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So this is sort of a philosophical question for you as practicing attorneys, right? So it's, there's always sort of the legal answer, and then there's sort of the counseling answer, right? Especially with all this sort of shifting ground, and in so many ways, there's always reasons to say no, right? No, you can't do this. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do this. But how do you sort of get to yes, and then in a way sort of in terms of being able to continue to operate? So how do you, as practitioners, how do you sort of manage that in terms of that sort of counselor phase, that counselor component of what you guys do? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, my mom was a counselor when I was growing up, so I always got asked a lot of questions. And I find that managing that in this process involves asking a lot of questions. And so, for example, if, a client says, hey, we've offered this person their job back and they don't want to come back. Okay, well, let's talk through those scenarios. What if we go down this path? What if we go down this path? What does this look like? And, sometimes you get to the answer where you say, essentially, this person wants to stay home a couple more weeks and we're not going to fill their job anyway. And so we might as well let them stay home a couple more weeks. Or you get to a different answer where you say, well, we've let them stay home a couple more weeks 3 times now, and they're still not coming back. And, our other employees are doing the work that they need to do. And I think asking questions about what does this path look like versus what does this path look like, and really just kind of talking it out. Those aren't always legal questions, right? I mean, a lot of these things, especially right now, do not have clear legal answers. There's no case law on what to do in the event of a pandemic. There's some guiding principles, but there's not a clear, you've now violated the law. Sometimes yes, right? Sometimes for sure, but sometimes no. And so, kind of navigating, we know these principles and we know these principles. And so here are the options in between those guardrails. How do they look for your business? And talking through that and those risks. I think most business owners really just need that, need someone to help them talk through those risk scenarios so they can make an educated choice for their business.
That awkward, I'm looking at you, Frank. Are you going to talk?
I'll let you go. Let you go first.
That's okay. You know, that's what some of our conversations consist of, right? It is a 15-minute consult with the clients just so they can have a little bit of certainty in putting the pieces together, so they know whether they're that outlier, they know whether they're sort of within those parameters. There's a lot of very fast instinctual decisions that have to be made. I find myself talking a little bit about the employee, right, that maybe got the third extra benefit. We are giving more grace than people deserve sometimes, right? This is a pandemic. It is a difficult situation to recruit employees. It's a difficult situation for employees once they lose employment to obtain a new job, right? Obviously, they're relieved of that obligation under job service. But as it stands, you know, we might be giving those employees who are opportunists are not going to be changed by the pandemic. They are still going to be an opportunist. But what you can do as the employer is sometimes it feels like we're encouraging bad behavior. Sometimes we're giving more grace than people deserve. But it's particularly under these circumstances, if we then have checked all the boxes that we've given them all the rights that they have, we've given them more grace than we need to in that situation for an at-will employer, then we can feel really good about having to be forced to make that decision that we have to part ways with them. This isn't a morality game. However, when we're dealing with all these different choices that go in there, when we're talking about legal liability, if you know that you've done all those, then you've probably checked all the boxes, even if you haven't intentionally done so. With the amount of uncertainty, you know, I find myself talking a lot to people that say, well, this person's going to be a suck on morale if we keep letting them continue, you know, doing this or cutting this corner or not being part of the team. But you know, we can handle that by giving them every opportunity we can to succeed. And then if they push us as far as we have to, then you can certainly part ways.
I'll just chime in by saying I really appreciate those comments and agree with them. But there's a couple of things that I find ironic. I think that this is, if you go back to, I think March 13 was the last somewhat normal Friday.
Friday the 13th, nonetheless.
Yeah. And so you go back before that, what the employment landscape looked like, how hard it was to find people, to keep people, how employees could really, they had a lot of leverage in a number of respects. And then that switch was just almost flipped just instantly. And I see it as more, it's like, I'm going to date myself here, but like when I was young, at least, if somebody accidentally turned off the lights in the gym, you didn't just flip them back on. You know, I mean, back then those lights it took 20 minutes, you know, sometimes half an hour before the lights would rise again. And I sort of look at this as, I guarantee you, I know that that there are going to be a lot of people who are working from home who never thought they were going to work from home. Because I've already heard a lot of employers say, we're not going to, there's a third, 20%, maybe more of our service industry workplace, which is no small thing, especially here in Des Moines, they're not coming back because we can monitor their productivity. They're being as productive. Now, I will say, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but I had one client say, you know what's amazing? We've been out, at that time it was 6 weeks. Nobody has used any PTO. No one's been sick. And these are including the people who we know, as soon as they acquire it, they use it. So I think we might see it. I think Kelsey alluded to it, you know, almost looks like taking a step back in time where you have sick leave, vacation, and, you know, maybe a personal day, something like that was all cast aside for good reasons. We might be seeing that again. We might be seeing a number of things that we didn't see, but I do know this, that both keeping track of what's going on in Washington and here with regard to the changing law, to me, it reminds me of camping in the woods, and at that end of the day where you probably stayed out too long and you're trying to get back to your campsite with that flashlight, you can see about maybe 2 steps ahead. I know that's how a lot of our clients feel. And I feel the same way sometimes.
Really interesting, really great thoughts. So thank you for that. We have another question with an issue we haven't really dived into yet, but this is a big issue for a lot as well too. Due to loss of funding and looking to move forward, we have discussed a decrease in pay. Is there anything we need to look at if we decide to decrease pay for some higher level employees? And I'll also add to this question in terms of what are some of those other issues, not only decreasing pay, but in terms of furloughs that employers need to be thinking about.
I can, and I'll be very brief and go back in reverse order. I've been talking with a lot of clients who have and already decreased pay across the board. And I've also been talking to a number, trying to work through furloughing exempt employees and the obligation to basically pay a full salary in a given work week. And trying to meld those two things. Those are issues we've been dealing with. So I can tell you that as long as they are, at least our opinion has been, as long as it's within reason, you understand the potential non-legal ramifications, a reduction in pay, absent, a written guarantee, et cetera, is something that you can do as long as you're mindful of the the FLSA minimums, et cetera. That's my 2 cents.
Totally agree, right? You're going to deal with the morale, you're going to deal with the concern. There's also partial unemployment in the state of Iowa for folks who are able to take advantage of that benefit if they see a reduction in their salaries. But a lot of this is the extra legal things that happen when you have to make those kind of tough business decisions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree completely that, you just have to be aware of the boundaries with respect to exempt employees when you're fiddling with their pay, and especially if you're changing their pay and their work hours and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of issues out there. So we've got just over 10 minutes left. And what I thought I would do is, if you guys are okay with this, maybe if there's one or two just really interesting issues that have popped up in the last 2 months that you never thought you would see before, or unique cases or types of issues that you're dealing with that are just really unique. Can we maybe start with Kelsey on that one?
Sure. So, one of the issues that I think has been unique is I mentioned earlier that there's kind of this bell curve. And so you've got people on the one end that are very concerned about leaving their house and folks on the other end that are really not afraid. And one of the issues that I think has been interesting and sort of challenging to navigate that some employers are dealing with are the folks on the end that are not afraid and are very vocal about that in the workplace, making the people on the other end of the spectrum really nervous. And, things like that started out, for example, back at the beginning of this, when you had folks that were continuing to go on cruise ships and vacation over spring break, and their coworkers would say, if they walk into this building when they get back, I am walking right out, right? I'm not working with them because they're posing a safety risk to me. And I think that's a weird conundrum from employers, right? Well, do we send the employee who just went on vacation home? Or do we tell the other people you have to work with them? And it implicates some laws that non-unionized employers don't work with very often. It implicates the National Labor Relations Act and the right of employees to get together and say, hey, we have a concern about our working conditions here. Now that we're starting to return to work, the same issues are starting to come up, right? You've got one employee who's talking about how they don't have any concerns and they're going out to barbecues and, down to the pool party at the Lake of the Ozarks and wherever it is that they're going, making other employees nervous. And we all want to be respectful of what people do outside of work. They're not doing things that are necessarily illegal, but managing that dynamic. I've typically told employers, start with a conversation, make clear to employees that when they are at work, you expect them to follow your safety rules, and, that they're making their coworkers uncomfortable. But that is a delicate situation. Employees do have certain rights to express their safety concerns in the workplace. And they don't necessarily have to be 100% right to be protected. And so that's a unique situation that doesn't come up a lot, that this is presented, that I think how you walk through that, you have to be real deliberate and real careful. And I think as a manager or as an owner, you also have to sort of check your own bias a little bit and recognize, you know, which side of the curve you fall on, because that's going to influence who you probably agree with a little bit and who you think is in the right. And be careful that that doesn't influence your behavior to the business's detriment.
Michelle?
Yeah, so there's been any number of wacky things that have happened since that Friday the 13th, right? And one of the things that I've had a lot of conversations about are, can I make my employee bring a doctor's certification that they can return to work? The doctor's certification, that conundrum, you know, that is ingrained in employer policies, that if you're not, you know, if you've been gone, or if you say you're going to be out sick, you tell me you've got COVID-like symptoms, well, then I'll see you when you can get a doctor's note. And that's been the kind of thing that has been very difficult for folks, because there are physicians, it just depends on where you are and who you're seeing. There are some physicians who are not going to give you a note that says that you're COVID-free. You might have a negative test, right? The tests are a little bit more available. I signed up, right? Even though I don't have any symptoms and I don't meet any of the high risk criteria, I signed up on Test Iowa, and I got approval to have a test. I can't get it scheduled yet. But, you know, testing is more available now. So there are employers talking about requiring a negative COVID test to return to work. You know, perhaps they were, you know, somebody traveled. Talking about how that medical certification relates to returning to work is very unpredictable, because we can't rely on the physicians to tell us. A COVID test, negative test, just tells us you don't have it at that very minute. You could leave there, go to the gas station, get exposed, and that test doesn't mean anything. So we don't have sort of the drug test equivalent of, oh, you've passed the test and now you can come back to work. So talking about policies that we can kind of put on a conveyor belt and help people, you know, move through all of these personnel issues has been really fascinating, and really does differ based on the community. So we're going to keep working through that, and hopefully we get an answer, and that medicine will answer this for us, because, you know, that's where we got to have it from.
I'll simply add that the thing that I've found somewhat frustrating, but not shocking or surprising, is that the political aspect of this, philosophical political, I'll put it that way. You know, I think someone alluded to it. There's some studies indicating that there are some people who are quite anxious and almost angry, and they're the ones that are at home. And I've been answering questions from some employers that they're angry that some employees who are deemed essential are being required to come to the workplace, even though they're not one of those people. And it seems counterintuitive. And with regard to the other opinion aspect of this, I mean, if you were to ask an engineer, are light guards good to have on a brake press? And the answer is, you know, as long as they're done correctly, yes. An engineer, or even physicians. I mean, there are physicians across the spectrum on some of these questions, you know, and we've had different advice come from some folks. Should I wear a mask? Should I not wear a mask? Is it contact, et cetera, et cetera? Well, that's the part of this that I think has been somewhat frustrating. And part of it is, I think, it's the way folks approach life. And take a look at Peggy Noonan's column from last weekend. And it gives you an idea, in my opinion, as to how folks decide how they're going to attack this.
Let's do one more quick lightning round, and then we'll have closing comments. So we've talked a lot about employment and labor law issues. In terms of your firms, what are the other biggest issues that you're getting from your clients outside of labor and employment regarding COVID-19?
I'll just say it's the PPP and the tax credits, and how that's been a moving target. The folks who, I mean, really good, long time Iowa brands that have the smaller ones that have had to take aid, and then they want to make sure that they do it right. We've been getting a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. The PPP, making sure that they're doing it right, that they're compliant. You know, folks want to be doing the right thing, but they also want to be protecting their business and their employees, and trying to navigate that has been a challenge for folks here in the last month or so.
Yep, PPP, and then certainly contract disputes, right? We've had a fair amount of the impossible to perform type, force majeure type disagreements and litigation that's going to grow out of that too. We're going to refine the parameters of that. We've also seen some folks wanting to dig into their insurance coverage about whether the exceptions are clear enough on the business loss interruption type insurance. So certainly there's been some of that as well.
Well, we are closely approaching 2 o'clock. I know time is of value to everyone on here. We're just going to do some closing remarks in terms of any final advice that you might have for folks who are listening today and moving forward in terms of addressing legal issues. And why don't we go Kelsey, Michelle, Frank?
You know, I would just say as you're looking at returning to work, to not look at your return to work plan as a one-way path back to the old normal. That, you know, it should be something that is flexible and adaptable, and you should go into it recognizing that you might roll forward and you might roll back to where you are now, depending on what happens in the future. And you know, we all sort of had to rush out of the office very quickly under not ideal circumstances. And so I would recommend that businesses take, if they get some breathing room as they start rolling back into the office, that they keep thinking about what would be nice to have if we go back out of the office, or some of our folks go back out, or we go into a temporary shutdown. You know, do we have the right equipment at home, or are suddenly half our staff going to have carpal tunnel syndrome? You know, what worked well and what didn't, and survey your staff members, because I think, you know, we would be well situated for a future outbreak if we did that, but we'd also be well situated for a blizzard or a tornado or something else that comes to us in the future, to really learn from the experience that we've had in the last 2 months, and you know, gain from it in that way as well.
100%, Kelsey. I mean, you know, that's what we've been talking about with our clients, is let's get agile. Let's figure out the solution to these problems so that nothing shuts us down, right? Even if you are a business that has to have people in sort of a traditional brick and mortar setup, you know, business continuity plans are going to be the key to success. You know, learn some lessons. The legal profession, I can tell you firsthand, is the most slow to change. And, you know, we've got just lightning speed moving through, people embracing technology who previously just weren't able to. And, you know, we're going to be able to talk about some really interesting solutions to workflow problems because of it. So, you know, this is the type of you know, pandemic, I guess, that's going to be also creating some great opportunities for us to modernize our businesses and to take those types of complications head on. So, you know, good luck to everybody out there, and you know, the Iowa economy is going to be just fine.
My advice, personal advice, turn off the news if you can on the weekend. Take a day or two. It's going to be there when you come back. But I will tell you, my wife and I did that this weekend, and she picked out the movie we watched last night. It was about St. Damien and the Malachi leprosy colony, and it was actually a fantastic story. But it kept reminding me of COVID-19, frankly, in a number of respects.
Well, thanks so much. Really great content today. So really appreciate Kelsey and Michelle and Frank joining us today. And I guess in terms of, you know, if the Supreme Court can have telephonic deliberations, I guess anything is possible, right? So, so anyway, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We know everybody's busy, but I know that these three who are all excellent attorneys and counselors. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to them directly. I know that they're great folks to work with. So thanks so much for joining us today. And at the Greater Des Moines Partnership, if we can be helpful in any way, just please let us know. I'm happy to talk with any of you anytime, as is our entire team. So thanks for what you're doing. Keep on keeping on. Let's keep moving DSM forward, and we'll see you next time. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay DSM strong.